myself out. I will introduce myself a little bit so we can get cracking. Yeah, you don't want my daughter's homework. Okay, so I rejoice in the job title of Chief Hacking Officer for Oracle Corporation. I run a very small team of security researchers, and what we do not do is security sign-off, right? The best description of my team is that we are the large hacker collider. We take Oracle products and we smash them to pieces in our labs, and then we look at what comes out of the detritus of the collisions, and we try and produce advice for the rest of the company. We have, frankly, far too many products for us, or any team of any size, to be able to go through in any kind of sensible way, right? There are, last count, I think, something like 1,300 products, but that goes up every day as we acquire companies. And we have such an aggressive acquisition program, I should say, welcome to Oracle. Resistance is futile. Your technological and biological distinctiveness will be added to our own at some point, I'm sure. And so what I'm going to do today is kind of a case study for what we do in my team. We take a product, we analyze it in various ways, and we're going to concentrate on a PIN database we managed to get hold of, and then we try and produce advice for the rest of the company. What we're not into is we're not into helping the hacker community in any way. Our interest is in defending our customers. If we get an exciting tool or something out of it, that's fantastic, and that's a nice, pleasing side effect. But we're not about, excuse me, I'm raging cold here, we're not about trying to develop hacker tools per se. That's not our focus. Our focus is on improving the products for our customers. Now, to make this a bit of fun, I thought we could all have a go and make this a live research exercise. So I'd like you all to think of a pin that meets these characteristics between 6 and 10 digits in length, and that you have a chance of remembering, and write it down and hand it in to our host, wherever he is. Right, he's going to click them in. So please get your pens and papers out while I write down a pin, and remember it, or keep a second copy. It doesn't matter, because I'm going to ask questions about your pin during this presentation. Okay, so here's the outline of the presentation. I'm going to describe the system we attacked in this particular case in very broad terms. We're going to have a look at how we might attack the system using various hacking and cracking techniques. And then we're going to look at how we might visualize the data. So we're going to do some numerical analysis on the PIN data set to see how we might visualize what it is. And then we're going to try and generate some advice that we might give to the operators and developers. And finally, we'll come to some conclusions. And if there's time, we'll do some questions. So, system characteristic. This work is done several years ago, and the product and the system is no longer in use. So I can talk about it reasonably freely. If it was in use, I wouldn't be able to. Okay? I'm not going to provide any details at all about the system, but why we were looking at it, what we found when we looked at it. I'm not going to disclose vulnerabilities in any way, assuming there were, because there might not have been. But you're going to assume there are, but I'm not going to tell you about them if there were. Okay? I'm not going to reveal any pins. It's fairly obvious what the pins are, but I'm not going to make it easy for script kiddies to just go and take my presentation and turn it into a tech tool. If you want to do that, you've got to do some work yourself. No customers were harmed in the making of this presentation. Okay, that's absolutely vital. If you're an Oracle customer, relax. Your data was safe throughout and since. Okay, the system required pins for a reason. It wasn't just a wild experiment. And the reason I asked you to choose a pin within those ranges is because that's how the pin space was managed in the particular system we were analysing. So what did we capture? Well, we got the pins. We got a complete set of clear text pins for all 12,000 users. In fact, we got a bit more than that. We got the database, which contained an email address, a telephone number, and a PIN. Now, before we wanted to proceed, we wanted to have a quick data sanity check. Was it worth carrying on? Well, the email addresses looked reasonable. We didn't validate them against an LDAP directory or anything like that. They just looked reasonable. The telephone numbers were user-entered data when users registered with the system. And there were a few bogus false ones in there, but there were a very small number of bogus telephone numbers. So the system wasn't sucking in data from the PABX or anything like that. nor was it taking direct, it wasn't seeding its data from a corporate LDAP directory. It was a self-registration system, and there were relatively few bogus numbers. So frankly, we just ignored them. For the purposes of analysis, we considered that good enough. And here is the frequency of the telephone numbers. So we can see there were a few people down here who were using their extension number, but the vast majority were a sensible sort of length for a telephone number. Some people at the far extreme end were going for the full international dialing code. Down here they were dropping off area codes and things like that, but they looked reasonable. But it is worth noting that although the telephone numbers are reasonably public, you still don't know as an attacker what the telephone number, as far as this system is concerned, you know, just by looking up in a telephone directory. So that's something you'd have to guess. Okay, so what we're going to do here is look at the effectiveness of various hacking and cracking techniques, right? Because what we're trying to do, excuse me, is come up with a sensible assessment of the risk in this system, right? Therefore, we need to know how effective a hacking and cracking techniques might be if they were deployed against this system. And we're going to look at it under 5 headings. We're going to look for Joe accounts, look whether dates were being used in the system, whether sequences were being used, whether patterns, and some basic dictionary attacks. Okay, a Joe account is where the password is based on the username, which of course in our analysis means the PIN is approximately related to the telephone number, or the PIN is approximately to the email address. Okay, and this is what we found when we do the results. Now the good news is, as you can see, a relatively low number of people were actually using their PIN as their telephone number. And it is worth remembering the telephone number is the telephone number in the system, not necessarily their real telephone number. The most significant case is clearly where the PIN is essentially a fragment of the telephone number. That's what that means, right? So the telephone number contains the PIN, and the PIN is based on the telephone number. The other analysis techniques weren't particularly useful, okay? But we did make a couple of other observations, right? Where the length of the PIN is the same as the length, then the PIN is the telephone number, with some degree of certainty, right? And again, about 5% of cases appear to be Joe accounts. But it is worth noting in terms of risk that about 0.7%, i.e. approximately 1%, that's certainly good enough for an automated attack. Right, you're going to pull out about 90 real users. That's good enough for an automated attack. It gives us our first assessment of risk. Okay, next look at dates. Right, we decided a PIN is a potential date if it is either 6 or 8 characters in length with European and American formatting. And we chose these ranges based on an assessment of the user demographic. We thought that would be an interesting range to choose. And what do we get? Well, if you look at things that look like 6-digit dates, we get a pretty picture like that. And if you look at 8-digit dates, we get a pretty picture like that. And it's pleasing to note that they are, broadly speaking, fairly similar. Okay, so what that teaches us, that dates appear to peak at birthdays and to a lesser extent life events, i.e. based on the demographic of our suspected user communities, i.e. your birthday or the birthday of your first child or your marriage or something like that seem to be what people were choosing. Okay, where it was a 6-digit PIN, it looks like about a third of them appeared to be a date. Where it was an 8-digit PIN, it also appeared that about a third of them appeared to be a date, which gives us an overall figure of about 25% of the PINs had the format and looked of a date. Hurrah! Sequences. We then defined a small database of sequences as something like repeated digits, increasing digits, or decreasing digits. And we came up with a very small dictionary of about 113, of which, pleasingly, we found about half of them in the real system. Hurrah! A nice, efficient dictionary. And look, about 14% of the pins turned out to be a sequence. So a nice, effective thing. We then looked at patterns, i.e. people creating pins based on patterns from the keyboard on the phone. Do people do this? Okay, so we defined a very small dictionary of 16 starting digits, 16 starting 3-digit patterns, and then we compared the first 3 digits of the pin against the pattern, and well done. About 12% appeared to start with a pattern, but of course a pattern is a sequence as well. 1, 2, 3 is a line across the top, so let's give us a fair assessment of if we remove sequences. Well, we end up with about 3% appear to start with those patterns, and we could do more analysis on this and find out what those patterns really were in use. We didn't do that. We noted in the actual research that it was about 270 unique patterns appeared to be in use. So we start with a 3-digit and down again, around the houses, about 270. So there's quite a few more patterns to add to our potential dictionary of interesting things if we wanted to choose that. Okay, next question. Do users convert words into numbers for pins? We don't know. So we used 3 dictionaries. We used a hacker dictionary of uncertain and dubious origin. And I have no idea where it came from. My team started, excuse me, more years ago than I care to remember, at least 10. We did create a password dictionary for our work at the time, and I've long since forgotten where it came from, but it's still useful and it's quite large. We also did some naughty work, because we also maintain a database, and I'm going to come back to this point later, of cracked passwords from other systems, and we thought, well, do people reuse their passwords? That would be an interesting thing to do. And we converted them using that standard, i.e. what you would do with text and mobile phone. And what did we find? Well, our general purpose hacker dictionary was bloody useless, but look at this. Much more effective when we tailored the dictionary to what we'd already seen. So we have some evidence of reuse. And in fact, it does turn out, when we looked into this in a bit more detail, that actually quite a few users were using PIN numbers anyway, and they just happened to be using the same PIN numbers for this system. Fine. So, we've done some basic hacking and cracking on our techniques. We've learned a bit about the numbers. How can we visualize the data and see whether that provides us any useful way in which we can judge the effectiveness of any remediation mechanisms we'd like to put in. Okay? So we're going to look at the properties of the pins as a whole. We look at the distribution of lengths, distribution of duplicates. We're going to see if they obey Benford's law. Actually, if you read Wikipedia, they shouldn't. But who cares whether received wisdom is appropriate? We're going to look anyway. And then we're going to look at the mapping of digraphs. And finally, we're going to see if we can come up with some sort of estimate of entropy in the system. Right. So, unique pin length frequency. So this is the unique pins. What a surprise! Given the choice, people choose the shortest pin they can get away with. Did you invent a pin? How many people invented a 6-digit pin? Let's see a show of hands. Nobody did invent a pin, you swines. Well, we'll not do that then. But there you go. I bet if you give them the choice, most people have invented a small pin. Actually, we thought it'd be fun to compare it against our hacker dictionary, and it's not a surprise. It was bloody useless. Because, of course, there was nowhere near enough 6-length words. There were probably a bit too many, or appropriate length, depending on how you want to regard the efficiency of the dictionary. It didn't stand a chance. Okay, that was that. Just an interesting observation by the side. But can we use the length of a pin as an efficient predictor of what the pin might be? Well, the answer is yes, we can. Right? Look, as the pin users tend to choose the shortest length they possibly can get away with. Where they choose the long length, guess what? It's the same as their telephone number. Right? We actually, for the 6 lengths, we have a pretty efficient way of determining what those are. Right? And when we get 8 lengths, we get more efficient because of the dates. But look at the sequences drop away. Right? So we can conclude that pin length is a reasonable predictor of what the pin might be. We can certainly make a more efficient cracking tool if we choose that. Okay, so let's look at duplicates. 399 pins with duplicates of about nearly 3,000, i.e. 21% were duplicate accounts. What's the frequency of the top 50? Look at that! Right, so it drops away remarkably. Now, these weren't system-generated pins. I want to emphasize that. People were choosing the same pins voluntarily of their own free will, right? So it turns out that people aren't as unique and as individual as they might like to think they are. And I think that's a powerful thing, and I'm going to come back to that later, because I think that leads to some interesting possible further research.
Howard, I have a question. Why didn't you use 4-digit pins? I've been using 4-digit pins for Bank of America, for instance, for the past 20 years.
Well, I don't know, because I don't know the system design parameters, right? This was not a telephone banking system or anything like that. This was, you know, I think it was an early WAP-based system, and that's just what they chose. And I think they wanted to get more security. Thought the longer the pin space, the more security there'll be. Okay, that's the definition of Benford's law. It's the first digit law, and it basically says that the first digit in a naturally occurring number tends to be biased towards the lower digits. So, do pins follow Benford's law? Well, Benford's law doesn't include leading zeros, of course, so I've added that and that doesn't plot it. You can see it falls away nicely. But yeah, there's kind of that shape about it. It's sort of interesting. Is it statistically significant? I'm not an academic. I don't care. It's interesting. That's good enough for me, right? And it has the same sort of shape if you look at that actual one including duplicates, or if you make them unique, it's the similar sort of pattern. Okay? So that it seems to me that the majority of people, or at least 30% of people, are going to choose a pin that begins with 1. Right? So that's a percentage. We just normalised everything to start with 30, just for the sake of giving us a shape. Right? Okay, so what about other digits? Okay, so this is a digraph. This is the number of times the 2 was followed by 0, followed by 1, etc. So we've got a nice mapping like that, far too complicated and far too dull to look at that. So we were naughty, we shouldn't really do that, and we plotted this as a surface contour plot, and you get a nice pretty picture. Now, of course, mathematically, that is not the right thing to do. It should be a 3-dimensional bar chart, but hey, this is prettier, and it's just a nice picture, and it can show us that there is a bit of a pattern there. Okay, so that's digraphs. What about estimating entropy? And here we have the graphic equalizer of entropy, right? Right? We assert that if there was this infinite entropy, we would have the same number of 1s and 0s and 9s across this, so this should be a straight line. If we believe Benford's law holds for pins, then we might expect a little bit of a base lift, but certainly not that, right? Now, whether that's statistically significant or not, I haven't done analysis, frankly. I don't need to. It's good enough for my purposes. And what we've done is shown that, yeah, okay, interesting. Fine, all very well. Can we do anything useful with this? Can we apply those visualization techniques to see whether we can measure the effectiveness of any pin control mechanisms we might want to put in place, right? So we're going to define a safer set of pins that includes the really obvious pin equals telephone number and sequences, just for the sake of this kind of comparison. And we get a set size of about 10,000 from 12,000, of which we get about 10,000 unique ones, as opposed to that. Okay, so what it appears we've done is we've knocked on the head of most of the duplicates. So when we look at pin length frequency versus the same set, well, yeah, it should be about the same, right? Because all we've done is kind of dropped off duplicates, and we're looking at unique pins here. So yeah, that tells us that. Okay, but look at this. We've taken that from about 900 to 20. So yeah, that shows that there's still quite a few people who are choosing the same sort of pin, but the frequency, the number of people choosing the same thing drops off remarkably. So hurrah, we've done something useful. What about Benford's law? Does it still apply? Well, yeah, it does, which is not surprising because it looks, all we've done is knock out a lot of duplicates, we've reduced the data set a bit. So yeah, it probably should look the same. And if we do a surface plot again, yeah, it's the same sort of picture. It varies a little bit, but it's what you'd expect because we haven't really changed very much at this point. What about the entropy? Well, yeah, actually, it's starting to be interesting. We've started to remove some of the shape, not very much, but we can see we're having a play with the faders, and it looks like we're possibly doing not very much of the entropy, but a little bit. Okay, let's define an even safer set. We're going to add dates to our safe set. Right, so oops, I've gone the wrong way. Yeah, even safer set. There we go. We have 7,000 odd pins and 7,000 unique ones now. So we've really knocked the data set on its head, and when we look at the frequencies, well, that's exactly what you expect. Since dates are 6 or 8 in length, then yeah, we've got rid of about a third of both of them, which is kind of what we'd expect. So that's only telling us what we already knew. Dates are obviously not chosen as duplicates very often. So this is in fact identical to the previous one. And if we look at Benford's law, well, it kind of still holds, but it's beginning to flatten out now. But it's still got the same kind of shape, so that's quite useful. And look what we've done to this. Now we've completely changed our surface plot. So we've certainly had an effect now. So that's just interesting, pretty picture. Thank you very much for that. And now we can look at our graphic equalizer and we can see it's much more the kind of shape we'd expect. A little bit of a base lift, and these guys are now looking a little bit more even. And so we can, I think we can assert with some confidence that we probably increased the entropy in the set. Okay, so what? We've broken the system and we've played around a bit, we've drawn some pretty pictures. What fun we've had! But of course, if we actually had a real system like that, would we go to senior management with those pretty pictures? Well, we might, and if we're lucky, we might see them dribble. Right? Senior management want to make decisions. We need to present our data in a way that will help them make decisions. So we need to tell them what it means in practice. Okay? So we need to come up with a little headline, and the one we came up with is that. All you need to know is 4 pins and you've got 10% of the accounts. That's all you need. And you can probably guess what those pins are now, but I'm certainly not going to give it away. Okay, so we've got a nice management-friendly summary that we can say, look, you're doomed, do something quick, you're going to die. Right, but it's no good, we need to design some advice. So can we combine what we've learned about pins and the effectiveness of the rules doing those 2 experiments to see if we can come up with some design goals? Now, important point, we've only got one chance to get this right. Right? However we got that data, we're not ever going to be able to get that data again. Right? Because that is absolutely going to go into one of our recommendations. Okay? If we get this wrong, then it's our job on the line here, because the next time this goes wrong, it will be a real attack, and people will be asking us questions about our advice. And secondly, we mustn't make things worse. It's very easy to come up with all sorts of funky schemes that would actually reduce the security of the system, right? So we're not going to come up with things that involve storing password histories in clear text so we can measure their, right? We're not going to do that. We're going to do simple things. Okay, so we're going to do a very coarse, and I'm not pretending to you this is anything like a formal risk analysis or threat model or any other of these funky things people like to do. But here are a couple of risks we might present to our senior management, right? We've got to accept the fact that whatever the state of the system is now, it's going to take some time to put in place remediation measures. We have to accept there may be a risk of external rediscovery during that time period. And so we're going to need to have a countermeasure plan in place. Now, we might decide the system is of such limited value that we're not going to worry about that. We'll just bear it in mind in case it happens. It might be a business critical system of such importance we can't stand the risk and we must turn it off. Or we might go somewhere in the middle and brief legal and PR so that they're ready to go should it happen. Okay, so data exfiltration, as we talked about, right? Whatever the reason we got this data, we can't allow that to happen again, right? So we've got to fix it, and that means we'll never see the data again if we do harm. Okay, so then we get to some more specific attacks. Are we worried about offline attacks? Now that would indicate something wrong, perhaps with our backup strategy, or it's just inherent in the design that somehow this data is, can be accessed by people like systems administrators or other people. And if we really care about that, the data is of that sensitivity, then we're going to have to do some fairly heavy-duty crypto. We may even have to remove user choice from the pins, so we might have to generate them randomly in order to guarantee the entropy or something like that. And that's going to involve significant changes to the UI. And it's probably going to be out with the scope of something we can do simply, but we might need to do that if we really consider that a significant risk, right? And then I've defined bulk access, right? Okay, so bulk access, what do I mean by that? I mean an attacker who does not care who he gets, he just wants to get an account, okay? So he's just going to take the telephone directory, dial up every single number and try a pin or password, 1 or 2, and then move on if he doesn't succeed. Okay, so I'm going to assert that to reduce that risk, we want to reduce the number of pin duplicates. And we're going to need to look at pin expiry and account lockout mechanisms and all those other good things. But that's going to really deal with that, is reducing the number of duplicates. And then we have, finally, a risk of targeted access. And that's where an attacker is after a specific individual, and obviously then we need to apply the normal sort of techniques to reducing the likelihood of being able to guess that person's password, i.e. if they are members of Facebook and they like to, here's a picture of me on my birthday yesterday, LOL, being sick, right? We need to obviously try and reduce that. So, right. So for bulk access rules, we want the pin space to be as large as possible. because we want our putative attackers to have a harder job as possible. Okay, so we tested rules that already reduced duplicates, and they were sequences and telephone pin, right? Were they effective? Well, yeah, I think they were. Actually, we were just playing around, but that was good enough. You know, previously the top 4 pins got 10%, now the top 10 gets us only 106. And they're quite difficult to guess pins. Okay, so before we go formal with this advice, we probably should review the duplicate pins that remain and see if we can improve our dictionaries in some way, but I think that was probably good enough. Now, we experimented with dates, but we didn't include pins based on the telephone number. That was probably a bit of a drop-off. But nevertheless, the data did look more random, the very first order of approximation. So the question then should we block all dates? Well, interesting question, because clearly there are a bunch of issues there. A date doesn't have to be a bad pin, right? A date based on your birthday is a bad pin. But still, an attacker has many options in choosing the date format. He might know you're American and choose an American format date. He might not. He might choose a 6 or 8 digit. He's still got a number of guesses on it. So maybe this is a case where we actually should worry about user education rather than some electronic measure. Maybe, right? We've got some hard thinking to do that, and we might want to take into account what account lockout and auditing mechanisms are in place. Okay, so we're going to come up with a set of simple recommendations so we can fix data exfiltration, like we already talked about. We're probably going to do something about hardening the cryptographic mechanisms. Clearly, if we got the data, somebody else could, so we're probably going to recommend do something like that. We're going to implement the following pin rules for sure. A pin that is approximate to a telephone number rather than just equal to a pin equals a sequence. That will knock on the head duplicates and some of the more obvious attacks. And then perhaps we should provide better education at the point of pin choice, especially regarding dates. Right? We might choose a different way of handling dates if we really were funky, but we certainly don't want to capture PII by we don't want people to enter, oh, please enter your birthday when they're choosing a pin, because that would then take us into the realms of collecting PII and all the pain and misery that brings us, unless that's part of the system already, in which case we might want to use it for that purpose. And then finally, once we've done it, we want a pin expiry mechanism. Okay, so that although we have a database of real pins, then it ceases to be useful for anything other than research purposes at that point, or you might think. Okay, so those are the kind of recommendations we might put together to the operational system. And the nice and pleasing thing about this is at least these guys, okay, can be turned into developer recommendations that we can carry forward to any future design system that's designed to work with pins. Okay? Because these are relatively straightforward, not particularly controversial rules that we can encode into standard functional design, standard functional specifications, or something or other security coding standard that might be useful for developers. Fine. Summary and conclusions. Right, user-selected pins are not random numbers, I assert. Users tend to choose the same pins, right? 21% of people chose a pin that at least one other person had chosen. And of course, there's the standard balance between threat and vulnerability. Sequences, I think we can sensibly get rid of. But taking away dates, we'd have to do some serious thinking about whether that was a realistic thing we could do. But I think there's some further work, and I think there's some ethical considerations we need to bear in mind for doing this, right? Now, I know that when it comes to engineers, right, ethics is a difficult subject. Engineering is to ethics as Luciano Pavarotti is to ice dance. Right? We're all particularly pathetic at it. It's quite entertaining to see engineers struggle. We're not trained to deal with ethics. We don't do those things. If you are at university and you happen to have a medical school, then why don't you go to some of the medical ethics lectures? It might be quite interesting and you might learn something. Actually, if you are at university and they happen to have a journalism school, then you might like to go on a headline writing course, because that's sure as hell going to help you summarise whatever reports you come up with for senior management in later life. So, it's very difficult to get hold of real data and to keep real data. Now, the question therefore is, would it be sensible to just ask people for a password and then do research from that on the basis that they would come up with something plausible? And then what sort of data size would be required to do that? But if so, should we do it? We know, because we've already found out, that people tend to choose the same sort of passwords. If I ask you to choose a PIN for research purposes that is plausible, the chances are it'll be a real PIN for somebody else. It'll be just as dangerous as a real database, right? So I think we have to worry about how we collect and what we do with this data. And of course, once we've got it, as I said, if you do manage to break into a system, it's really difficult to repeat the analysis. Nobody's going to thank you for going back in and to repeat the experiment to see how effective the remediation mechanisms are. Right? No one is going to thank you if you go to Facebook for your set of employees, for whatever company you're in, and start doing research about whether your employees actually stick their birthdays in their Facebook profiles. Right? Can you imagine the legal fallout? Right? It's not going to happen. You're never going to be allowed to do that. You are playing in the dark. We are at a disadvantage compared to the black hats. Tough is the way it works. We just have to do the best we can. And so I'm going to leave that as something for you to think about. Now, users tend to choose the same password. We've known that. So I leave as a piece of further work for you to consider the password paradox. Right? We know about the birthday paradox. The password paradox, I assert, would be something along the lines of how many users of Amazon do you have to get in the same room before any two of them happen to have the same password? And the chances are that's probably a small number. But I don't know what it is, and I haven't got the time and inclination to actually try and do the mathematics to work it out. But I leave that as a little challenge for you, based on some sort of estimate of the distribution of duplicate passwords, which looks like an exponential decay, then you might be able to do that. Okay, so my final conclusion to it. As we've said, given the choice, over half users choose the shortest permitted PIN, even with no default PIN. About 20% of people choose the same password, right? 25% appear to be a date, 5% appear to be related to a telephone number in some way, 14% are secrets. And look, if you're in the position of choosing PINs, then maybe you want to choose an odd number for the length of your PIN, because that probably is the hardest to categorise. And on that happy note, I'm done. Questions?
Is that we have to look at PINs and passwords, not at a particular application or one password in isolation, but all the PINs and all the passwords that a single person uses. Because there are other investigations that show that people might have 20 or 30 services they use, but it turns out they only have actually 2 or 3 different PINs or passwords or schemes, where when I say scheme, that means the same kernel of a password, and I simply add a prefix or a suffix. So you've done a beautiful analysis of a database of passwords, but how could you analyze all the passwords of this or PINs of the same person? You know, that would.
Well, I assert that you can't, and you shouldn't.
Well, a PhD student in New Zealand did exactly that. He didn't ask for people's passwords, but he asked related questions, characteristics of their passwords, and he found, made that conclusion specifically, that people tend to use 2 or 3 schemes for their passwords. And you might recognize this, that you don't have all these different passwords, but you have the same sort of first block of thing, and then you just simply add a separate digit or a character or something.
Yeah, no, I quite understand. I mean, that is, received wisdom, and I don't doubt that it's true. I think my point is that, obviously we're doing an empirical analysis based on the data we have actually available to us to generate some specific advice. You're extending that to the general case, which is fine. But I would argue that kind of research, while very interesting, is also straying into rather dangerous territory, particularly for us in industry, right? I mean, if you want to do that kind of research in academia, well, fine. But for us, I can't do that. I can't go to Oracle staff and say, guess what? We've worked out what all your passwords are. Here they are, right? The implications for that are just phenomenally bad, right? So we just can't go there. That's the problem. And we do have an ethical problem, which puts us at a disadvantage, certainly in industry, because there are certain things we sensibly can't research into without risking all hell breaking loose, right? I mean, particularly for an American company, which tends to have very good lawyers. Right? There are some things, some places we just can't go, and that's fine. I'm happy with that, because as I say, I think it puts, were we to try and create those kind of databases, well, what would we do with them? Where would we go, right? I mean, there comes a point where you have to tell users, your user community, here is some advice, right? And if you choose to ignore that, well, where do you go? I mean, you need auditing, you need backups, you need log files, you need to be able to detect attacks. I don't think you can sensibly protect against them unless you start going down the route of handing out random passwords, in which case you create another set of user problems, right? Some of the military systems will hand out randomly generated passwords. Well, fine, but what do users of those systems tend to do? Well, they tend to write them down in a somewhat obfuscated fashion in the back of their diary. Is that any better? I don't know. I don't suspect so. But your point is valid. I don't think it's something we can really do much except acknowledge.
I'd like to go ahead and add to that. So he covered that somewhat in mentioning, in the event that you have a database that you have access to do analysis on in the first place, well, the problem is that you got access to it, and of course, once you do the proper work, you won't be able to get access to that again. So, in a way, it's an extension of it, you're falling back to asking users what kind of pins they use or what construction they use, and that in and of itself would, I think, highly bias the data to a significant extent. Maybe you can rule some of that out statistically, but to a great deal, if you just ask users, like, what kind of passwords do you use, I think a lot of people are going to suddenly create better systems than they have. And ethically, legally, trying to assess all of the users' passwords, you shouldn't be able to assess a database of even one database of their passwords. That therein lies the problem, people storing plain text passwords and so forth. I don't see, I think really that if that was actually a possibility where you can access these multiple databases and coordinate that information, that is the problem. Actually analyzing that data is a completely different topic. I think we should be making sure that we're designing systems such that that kind of analysis isn't even possible.
One question. You're saying that if you were to break and crack the pins and passwords of users, all hell would break loose. I mean, you do have users with root access, and you do have users with domain administrator access on Windows. So they can access your data without knowing your password anyway. So why would it be so incredibly dangerous to do password cracking in order to actually have a realistic risk exposure considering weak passwords?
I think we need to separate two things. First of all, you need to look at the Oracle product stack. And we do have products that make it difficult even for systems administrators to look at data stored in database tables. We do make it as hard as possible. And we certainly do deploy those internally. And so, while I accept that it is impossible to totally prevent access from a root or a DBA, we can certainly make it harder. And we can set up, I think, what we would call thresholds, intentional thresholds, if you like, where these guys aren't going to stumble upon this data accidentally. Right? They've got to do something. They've got to make a positive choice, a positive selection, a positive action to get hold of the data, which in effect sets up a legal threshold for these guys to get hold of the data, which means we can fine minimally because they've done something they shouldn't do. Right? And that's what we'd like to do. Now, whether all our customers deploy the databases in those ways, I don't know, but you can certainly buy products such as virtual private database, transparent data encryption, and these kind of products that will attempt to make it harder for administrators to get hold of this data without going through specific steps. Okay, so I take your point there that in general it's very difficult to do that. Then the second question is, well, to do those kind of analyses, do you need the clear text password? And I assert not, because I in fact have written a tool that is deployed quite widely inside Oracle, and that does precisely what you say, but it does not reveal the clear text password. It has a set of audit rules built in. It decrypts the passwords if it can, in memory. It's not a perfect tool. Certainly someone could hack it and stuff that out, but what we really want is, I don't need to know what a user's password is in order to be able to tell them that it's weak, right? That's the thing. If I'm doing an audit, I want to set up some rules and say your password doesn't include an uppercase character and a digit. That's all I need to tell somebody who's doing an audit. I don't need to tell them your password is Fred, right? Why would I do that? And I don't need that data. It's dangerous for me to have that data because suddenly that user can't be held accountable for their action at that point, right? So what I need to do is tell them they've got a weak password. I'll tell the administrator there are a set of weak passwords, but I don't need to give them in clear text. That's how we would put these tools out. And tools like Enterprise Manager, for example, that don't have a very limited database password audit function. I think that's what it does. It might be wrong, but certainly the tool I wrote does exactly that. And that was at the request of Oracle Legal. And it made sense, I think, to do that. Why would you give administrators real users' passwords? It just creates more trouble for this work.
Any more questions? No? Well then,
I end up adding another follow-up. So, you know, of course, in the very least, the passwords themselves should be stored in some fashion that's not plain text. But beyond that, not just talking about like a salted password, but the various password stretching functions that exist, especially for the way a password is stored for generating a key for, say, an encrypted hard drive. A proper use of a password stretching function, which in general make it such that you won't be able to get those passwords. You shouldn't be able to, at least not within a reasonable period of time. And that sort of thing is well beyond the scope of most developers. You know, getting them to hash and salted is one thing, but I assert that the system, if the system allows you to recover passwords in any fashion, the system itself is broken. Any sort of audit rules or restrictions for who can see the data, well, even if they see the data shouldn't be able to do them any good. That's, I mean, that's my opinion. But if
no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that should be our design goal, but we have to accept that we may have legacy systems in place, and we have product roadmaps. You know, it takes time to improve products. And it takes time to get those products deployed into the real world in a supported fashion. Right?
Like that's what I would recommend. At the same time, if everybody did that, my entire project would not exist.
So I think we have a period of time before that nirvana takes place, right? Because we've just got to have a roadmap.
So we're looking more towards short-term countermeasures.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, then we will do a 15-minute break.